All right, so sovereignty. So in this section, we will be briefly exploring what sovereignty is, how First Nations people first gained their sovereignty, and what sort of impacts our sovereignty has today. What sort of impacts, exist on our sovereignty today. So to start off with, we've got a few questions here. If anybody wants to have a crack at answering any of these, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. And then we'll get into it a bit more. So first off, what does sovereignty actually mean? What does it include and what does it look like?
I would say it's control over your own affairs on your own land in your own space.
Yep, definitely is. So does anybody want to expand on that a bit or maybe give an example of what sovereignty looks like?
Yeah, I can have a go. I would say it would also be control over like a certain areas, like, whether or not a mining company comes in and is able to mine somewhere or a national jurisdiction is imposed on an area. So control over a territory.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So it is both of those things and it's a bit more as well. So sovereignty refers to the supreme and independent authority of a nation to govern itself and make decisions within its own borders without interference from external actors. This means that the nation has full control over its own political, economic, and social affairs, and it's not subject to the authority or control of any other nation or any other external power. So, what does First Nations sovereignty look like? Does anybody want to have a crack?
Self-determination.
Yep, yeah, definitely a major aspect of it.
Self-governance.
Yeah. So in a First Nations context, it is both those things. It's self-determination and it's self-governance, but it's a bit more than that as well. So when we're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about how First Nations people have this unceded right that we hold collectively. So this is a very important part of this. It's something that's collective possession for us. It's not something that an individual holds. It's collectively held by the people, the members of, individual Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander nations. And that right grants us the usage, the access, and the management, as well as the custodianship over all of our lands, our waters, our minerals, and our natural resources. It also is the right of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to exercise an unimpeded and collective self-determinant governance over their political, economic, cultural, and social affairs. So what this means is, that's the self-determination right there. That's us having full control over our affairs and not having them dictated to us by some other government, some colonial occupation such as the Australian government. It is us having our own government systems in place to be able to manage all of our own affairs. And thirdly, it's being able to enact, alter, and enforce laws. Laws that, look after the land, that look after the management of natural resources, as well as laws that govern the people and what they can and can't do. So all of these things definitely existed for us before colonization. Before colonization, we had all sorts of different governance systems in place to manage, how often we'll go out hunting, how often we'll chop down trees from a certain area, when we would go and do burn-offs, when we would go and do initiation ceremonies, or we would meet up with our neighboring nations for wider governance structures and for wider meetings to, organize those cross-nation government events. And, I'm using the word government here, but it's in a very different context to how we think of a government today. It's think more along the lines of sort of the elders councils that we used to have, but much further than that, it wasn't just the elders councils. There was all of those other systems in place we had as well to control law, because at the end of the day, we had a lot of legal systems here in place before colonization. You couldn't just walk into another people's land. You couldn't go and take resources from another nation's land. That would be breaking law. You couldn't marry certain people because that would be breaking law, or you couldn't, do certain things outside of other social contracts, such as marriage. All right, so how did Indigenous people first gain sovereignty? How long has our sovereignty existed? How does a nation, whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous, gain their sovereignty to begin with? And is there any difference between Indigenous sovereignty and sovereignty in a European sense? And if so, or if not, why would people think that? Does anybody want to answer any of these questions before we move on?
I can have a stab at the first one.
Yeah, go for it.
I would say as long as 120,000 plus years for sovereignty.
As long as you people have been custodians of a land.
I'd say any time that people have been making decisions for themselves. So, like, I'm really thinking back to even before we had fire.
Yeah. Anybody else before we look at the answers to these questions? What about the that third point there, the difference between indigenous sovereignty and sovereignty in a European sense?
Yeah, I think that Indigenous sovereignty and sovereignty in a European sense has been really challenged with the voice to Parliament, where in international law, sovereignty, it means what it means. It's sovereignty and it's control and self determination over one's land, political and cultural sovereignty over the place that you live and the future of your peoples. And then the government, who claims it has sovereignty over this land, then tries and spits in our face and says that our sovereignty is only spiritual.
And that's like a really good point too for what we're about to go into, looking a bit more at the treaty aspect in the next section.
I'd like to also add, kind of in a European sense, it's like legal ownership of land with a piece of paper that says, this is my land and you can't stand on it. And that almost gives people some kind of sovereignty to it. Whereas Indigenous sovereignty is also being responsible to the land and looking after it, not just I'm entitled to this land, but this land is entitled to me looking after it as well.
Yeah, very important point for that last bit. My apologies, everybody. It seems that I have lost the slide here. I do have the notes for us, so I'm just going to read the notes to you all. So, how did Indigenous people first gain our sovereignty? Indigenous sovereignty has existed since time immemorial, and it is as old as our cultures are. But when we're looking at how sovereignty first came about here on this continent, we have to look at the legal implications of sovereignty and the legal definitions of sovereignty. So generally speaking, when a group of people want to establish a new country, they need to do several things to make it happen. First, they need to have a defined territory, which means they need a specific area of land that they can claim as their own. Now, this territory could be a region within an existing country, or it could be a previously unclaimed area. Now, how this relates to the context of First Nations people here is that one thing that is absolutely central to our people's culture, our spirituality, our way of life, and our very existence is our connection to country. And not just any country or anybody's country, but the connection to our own country, our own land. One thing that Aboriginal people never did was go out looking to claim other people's lands and abandon our own lands to go and settle somewhere else. Now, I'll go more into our relationship with the land a bit further along in this class, but what I'm getting at here that is relevant for this point is that our people had defined territories, and until 1788, these territories weren't challenged. Now, the second thing, people need to establish themselves as a sovereign, entity or sovereign body, is they need to have a stable government in place, which means that they need a system for making and enforcing laws and for providing services and support to the citizens. Now, again, when we look at it in the context of First Nations people here, despite this whole romanticized noble savage trope that we are portrayed as in the colonial system, our people actually had very complex governance structures which did all of these things. They upheld and enforced our laws, and they allowed our people to centrally plan things like our resource extraction and how these resources would be used to cater to the needs of the people, which is essentially providing a service and support. Now, finally, the third point for how sovereignty is established is they need the ability to engage in international relations, which means they need to be recognized as a sovereign entity by other sovereign entities. So prior to colonization, our people would very often engage with other nations, and we had a lot of rules and protocols in place to ensure diplomacy and to allow our people to not only prevent conflict with each other and respect each other's borders, but to also be able to work together. We had a lot of international trade between not only Aboriginal nations here on the continent, but right across Southeast Asia. And we had, stuff like massive festivals and corroborees, which could see people traveling hundreds or even thousands of kilometers across several nations' borders. Through that process as well, they'd have to go through, I suppose, the equivalent of customs, going through announcing themselves to these other nations, seeking permission to travel across their nation into the next nation, and so on and so forth. And another real important point here is we had massive feats which spanned several nations and language groups, such as large pre-colonial agricultural states that existed throughout much of the east half of the continent. These massive agricultural states spanned several nations and language groups. We also had massive eel and fish trap systems out in what is now Western Victoria and New South Wales, which again spanned several language and nations groups. And what was needed for that to happen was international cooperation and the ability for people to be able to coordinate with each other on a national level, which is just further proof and evidence of our, sovereign ability to do so prior to colonization. So, we don't know at exactly what point, tens of thousands of years ago, that our sovereignty was first birthed, for lack of a better term. But what is certain is that it definitely existed long before 1648. Now, 1648 was the year when European nations first came up with the concept of sovereignty and first established themselves as sovereign nations. Our sovereignty, as they define it, existed long before that.
I have a question which
Yep.
might be jumping the gun a little bit. In in a modern context, now that we are governed under a European or colonialist government system, and now Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders are seen as a collective rather than individual countries or communities, I suppose. How can individual Indigenous communities keep their individual sovereignties amongst a European sovereignty?
There we go. Is this kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, sorry. No, yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Now we're going to get to all that. We are going to answer that. But yeah, that's a great question. Does anybody else have any kind of like similar questions along those lines as well that they want answered? Or want to have a crack at, maybe answering that question or one of these questions on the screen now?
Well, terra nullius is a term that was used to justify stealing this land and decimating our population. Was only a term that was sort of coined to wrap up all of the acts that had occurred, and it wasn't like a legal term that was used at the time. But one thing that was used at the time was a thing called the doctrine of backwards peoples, and so this was a legal term that allowed for European powers under international law at the time to take the land of others if they deemed that the society that they came to didn't have a system of laws and governance. And it wasn't that we didn't have a system of laws and governance, it's that we had a system of laws and governance that was different to theirs, and therefore that was backwards. And so that gave them their rights under their international laws to then steal this land.
And that's the thing too, like, we've got to recognize that, our sovereignty does still exist. But the thing is, we've got to recognize that there's 2 points here. There is the authority to have your sovereignty, and there is the ability to enforce it. Now, we still retain our right of our sovereignty. We still have that authority, but what we lack right now is the ability to be able to enforce our sovereign rights. Now, when we look at rights, rights only exist so far as they can be enforced. If you have a right, but you cannot enforce that right, you got to look at the philosophical question of whether or not that right is even a right, whether it's a right that even exists. Now, we still do have our sovereign rights under international law because we haven't ceded them, despite, the laws that existed at the time that they tried to use to justify our conquest. Even then, those laws still didn't actually give them the consent and the authority to come and do what they've done here and to come and lay claim to this land, which again, is not to go on about the voice again and stuff, but that was a big part of the voice. And why the voice was pushed so hard and why it had its origins going right back to 1996 when Wesfarmers, who are now BHP, were lobbying the Howard government over Aboriginal sovereignty and the fact that Aboriginal sovereignty posed a massive risk to their resource extraction, especially up in the Northern Territory. But, coming back to the point here, though, we do still have our sovereign rights, but what we don't have is the ability to be able to materially enforce those sovereign rights. So what our sovereignty looks like today is, I suppose, it exists on paper, but what's really lacking is the ability for us to go out and do it. Now, somebody was asking just before, sorry, I didn't catch your name, about, individual sovereignty of nations. And this is something as well that we really need to explore from a philosophical point as well. Because, why, yes, our sovereignty and our nationhood did fit all of the criteria under international law and under European law and, under the Westphalian treaties, which give the definitions of sovereignty, why it did fit all of that stuff, our governance structures were still different. They were more. They done all of that, but they done a lot more as well. And, somebody else mentioned earlier about how our sovereignty also included having this custodianship and responsibility to care for the land and to look after the land and belonging to that land as much as the land belonged to us. And that is something that, European sovereignty in their definitions doesn't fully capture. Michael Mansell makes a really great point when he talks about when before colonization, even though we had all of these different languages, when you look at the way that our nations did cooperate with each other and you looked at the way that we had regional governance structures, it kind of opens up a debate on whether or not Aboriginal Australia really was 250 plus nations, or whether it was one nation prior to colonisation made up of several hundred languages and several hundred regional councils which managed their own regional affairs and had their own regional laws. Which, when we look at Australia today, even, under a colonial context, isn't necessarily, that different. We've got all these councils who have their own governance structures in place, their own bylaws in place, and, whatever else in place. And we've got state governments and we've got the federal government. It does open up a bit of a debate about, how do we define Aboriginal nationhood? Is it something that can be defined as 250 plus individual things, or is it something that can be defined as one unit? Now, I'm stressing here, I'm talking about just the mainland, obviously not including Torres Strait Islanders, who had, again, a very similar but very different cultural structure and very different but similar governance structure as well to mainland Australia. But for us in the BPU, the way we look at it is we want to have a pan-Aboriginal movement across the continent, which means we want to unite all of the different Aboriginal nations that exist on the continent so that we can be that one united force. Because as it's currently standing, trying to fight all these individual battles with 250 plus individual nations coming up against the one colony, nothing's getting anywhere. But if we could all unite together and we could all stand together and we could all, come to the table as one united force, we could have a lot more push with fighting back against the colony. Even if it is for just concessions and reforms and not actual revolution, we could still achieve so much more as one pan-Aboriginal unified force. And so, from our perspective in the BPU, that is something that we are striving towards. And it does mean to some extent, I suppose, somewhat of the eroding of individual nations' sovereign rights. But at the same time, it opens up so much more potential for all of these individual nations. And even then, the sovereign rights that are being eroded away for these individual nations are more to do with stuff on a continental-wide scale, not to do with how they would manage their own people or their own sacred sites or their own lands or natural resources, etc., etc. But yeah, does that kind of answer the question, I suppose?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for taking the time
No
out
worries.
of the class to answer that question.
Too easy. Alrighty, so moving on, tied very strongly with our sovereignty is treaty. Treaty is something that mob have been pushing for a few decades now on the continent. It's also something that, other First Nations people in New Zealand and United States and Canada and elsewhere around the world have been able to successfully be able to, get for themselves. But we're going to explore a bit about, treaties, because it is something that is often talked about and thrown around, but it's very muddied and very murky when we actually look at what a treaty is and, all the different kinds of treaties and the fact that there is even different kinds of treaties to begin with. is something that's not often talked about. So something we want to do in the BPU is really start talking a lot more about treaties, just to provide that, free, prior and informed consent to people, that free prior information. So people, when they do make a choice about treaty, can actually come to a properly informed decision instead of just going with, the mainstream sort of talking points on treaty. So in this section, we're going to look at what a treaty is, the different kinds of treaties, what a treaty process could look like here in Australia, and whether or not treaties actually work. So what is a treaty? What does treaty mean? Alrighty. What is a treaty? A treaty is an international agreement in writing between two or more states or international organizations, and it is governed by international law. A treaty is an example of a source of international law as well. So, back in 1969, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties set down the international laws and rules relating to the practice of treaty making. It defines a treaty as a formal settlement, contract, or agreement between two or more nation states or international organizations that sets out their rights, their obligations, and their responsibilities in relation to a specific issue or area of cooperation. Treaties can cover a wide range of topics, including trade, security, human rights, the environment, and many other topics, and they may be bilateral, which means between two parties, or they may be multilateral, which means between 3 or more parties. But even if a document is agreed between 2 or more sovereign countries, it would not be a treaty unless those countries actually intend the document to be binding under international law. Now, once they are signed, they are typically subject to ratification by each party's respective government. What that means is, like in the context of Australia, for example, just because it makes it a bit easy to explain, when Australia enters into an international treaty, say, for example, a treaty with the UN, say, for example, a human rights treaty of some sort or a human rights agreement of some sort, even though Australia has signed on to that and agreed to it, it's not actually binding on a domestic level here in the country, here on this continent, until the Australian government takes whatever's in that treaty, writes it into legislation, and actually legislates it into our laws. Now, that's what we're talking about when we talk about ratification. That's what ratification is. It's taking a treaty and turning it into legislation so that it can be actually enforced by the Australian colony internally here. So once a treaty is ratified, it becomes binding on the parties, and it's considered part of, enforced by, and interpreted through both domestic laws as well as international law. Now, treaties can take many different forms. They include things like conventions, protocols, agreements, memorandums of understandings, and a whole bunch of other things as well. The negotiation and the implementation of treaties can sometimes be important tools for actually promoting international cooperation between two different groups, for resolving disputes, and for advancing the interests of the states as well as the global community in general. Now, when we're talking about international law and domestic law, it is important to note that, international law is very different and very separate from Australia's domestic law. The treaties that Australia ratifies only become a part of our domestic law when the Parliament actually passes through that legislation I was talking about just before. If there is no legislation, treaties cannot impose obligations on individuals, and they cannot create domestic rights here in Australia, which is, a major sort of issue that we have come up against with the signing of different UN conventions and UN treaties that Australia has done, but they haven't actually ratified them into Australian law, which means even though they've signed onto them, they're non-binding. One of these is UNDRIP, for example, with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Australia has signed on to this, but they haven't implemented any of the points into legislation. So even though they've signed it, it means absolutely nothing, and it does nothing whatsoever for blackfellas here. Although treaties were signed between Indigenous and the colonial occupations of present-day New Zealand, United States, and Canada, we have, as I was saying before, never had a treaty on this continent between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, not one between Indigenous people, I'll correct that, sorry, not one between Indigenous people and the colonial government. We have had treaties, I suppose you could call them, between individual Indigenous nations and individual property owners. One example of that might be the Batman Treaty, which was signed down here in Victoria, but that is not a treaty between the Australian government and First Nations people. We also have to factor in that even in the places where a treaty with First Nations people has been signed, like New Zealand, the US, and Canada, those colonising powers still commonly attempt to deny those Indigenous people their sovereign nationhood and their sovereign rights, and instead they recognise them as domestic entities. Now, the significance of this is, and this comes back to what we were talking about before about First Nations sovereignty as well, and the whole voice thing that Jasper brought up before. Here in Australia, the Australian government views First Nations people as domestic entities of Australia. Now, what that means is we, as far as they're concerned, fall underneath their governance and fall underneath their sovereignty and their structures. Now, it's the same for Māori people, it's the same for the First Nations people of Turtle Island. You know, their colonial occupations don't actually view them as independent nations the same way they would view China or the UK or, you know, Mexico or anywhere else as an independent nation. Instead, they view them as what's called a domestic entity, which is very important when we're going to look at the effectiveness of treaties. So what kinds of treaties would take place between a colonial government and First Nations people here in Australia? There's four kind of main kinds of treaties. We refer to some of these as treaties, although they're not technically treaties under the definition of treaty that was, you know, set out under that Vienna Convention I was talking about earlier. So first and foremost, there is, of course, international treaties. Now, one form that a treaty could take, potentially, here in Australia, is a treaty under international law. Now, this form of treaty would hypothetically be enforced by international law, and it would potentially be the strongest treaty that we could enter into. The two major contradictions here, though, are first, that the colonial government does not legally recognise our sovereignty and our independence, and as such, takes the approach that we're not legally able to enter into an international agreement, and instead it sees us as a domestic entity, as I was just talking about before. Despite this, the UN did a study on treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements between states and Indigenous peoples, and they upheld the view that treaties with Indigenous people can be entered into at the international level, and concluded that where Indigenous people had not yet entered into treaties with colonising countries, that they should actually be treated as nations and assume they have the ability to enter into treaties until it's proven otherwise, which is something that has not happened here. So even though Australia does recognise us as a domestic entity, the UN recognise us by extension of their resolutions as being an international entity with the ability to enter into an international treaty or agreement. The other major contradiction here, though, is, as we mentioned earlier, rights only exist so far as they have the power accompanying them to be able to enforce those rights. Now, Australia has an absolutely horrendous track record of violating treaties and other international agreements. One prime example is their violations of the UN human rights treaties. Now, Australia has been a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights since 1980. Despite this, between 1994 and 2021, the UN ruled Australia in breach of this covenant at least 47 times. And of those 47 breaches, the vast majority received no remedy. Even when the UN determined an appropriate remedy for Australia, Australia delivered no remedy to, I think it was 2 or 3 out of these 47 breaches that they actually compensated. And the other, 44 or 45 were just swept under the rug, received no sort of compensation, no sort of remedy for having that treaty violation, or nothing happened to Australia as a result. Now, these are 47 breaches that the UN has noted. These aren't breaches that have been swept under the rug by the UN as well, or that haven't even made it to the ears and eyes of the UN. These are 47 breaches that the UN has turned around and pulled Australia up on doing. And that was in a, 26-year period. They're doing these breaches once every 6 months or so, according to the UN. And that's just from one treaty. of the several that we've signed on to with the UN. Australia has an absolutely atrocious track record. On average, we actually break UN treaties here. When I say we, I mean the Australian government, not we as in blackfellas, of course. The Australian government and the Australian people and the Australian system breaches treaties on an international scale, on average, something like once a week. Absolutely ridiculous. Now, when we take this into consideration, you know, it doesn't really put much support in my mind for a treaty of an international level with Australia. You know, if they can make all these breaches against other sovereign nations that are recognized as sovereign nations by Australia and by the UN and get away with it, what hope do we have on pulling them up when they breach treaties that we would sign with them? Even if we did manage to pursue some sort of ruling against Australia violating our treaties, you know, what power would we have to uphold the judgment? The UN can't be relied upon to police nation states, and we can't be sure we can actually be sure that powerful member states like the USA, who regularly do fulfill that role of international police, would not work against its own interests and Australia's role within the tri-state imperial power that is the US, the UK, and Australia. You know, if these treaties get breached, what are we going to do about it? The answer is not a lot. Now, secondly, second kind of treaty is an agreement supported by and or enshrined in the Australian Constitution. Now, this is not actually a treaty per se, as it isn't an agreement entered into by two or more nation states, but rather the recognition and assimilation of one nation state into another. So if we were to go down this route, we would be acknowledging and accepting the colonial position of viewing Indigenous people and nations only as domestic entities within the framework of the Australian colonial government. Further to this, we can be sure that any disagreements on the interpretation of this agreement will be decided upon unilaterally or by one side only, which would be the colonial court systems. We wouldn't be deciding on violations of the treaty or interpretations of the treaty. The colonial court systems would. We can also be sure that extra legislation would be introduced by the colonial government to further restrict the powers and the interpretations of any sort of constitutional amendment that actually provided us power. And ultimately, the Australian Constitution is not a document that grants obligations, and it doesn't even grant rights. What it does is provide a scope of powers that the government may act within if they wish to. It doesn't compel them to do anything. It doesn't force them to do anything, just as they can do it if they want to. The third type is an agreement that takes place in the form of legislation. Again, just like the last one, this is not actually a treaty, even though it is often called a treaty and referred to as a treaty. One really great example is what was happening down here in Victoria recently with this whole Victoria state treaty process. Now, these aren't treaties. They're state-based legislation with the word treaty in its main title, and that is all. And just like any other state legislation, the potential for any current or future government to amend it, to repeal it, to abolish it, to do whatever they want with it is always a risk. And it is always something that we would have to contend with every new incoming government that came along. Because, you know, state legislation can be amended by any government. We have been seeing, as I was saying just before, this narrative around treaty being shifted more in this direction. Victoria was committed to a process, but they seem to be a bit up in the air with it now. But we've also seen Queensland, South Australia, and I think maybe WA. I was a bit unsure about WA, but it looks like they were starting to entertain these processes as well. And finally, the final kind of treaty that can take place is a contract. So a treaty that takes the form of a contract would hypothetically be one of the easiest to enter into, as it would not require a lot of parliamentary process to be implemented. It would just require the political will of the government of the day to actually enter into that treaty. It would be negotiated by the federal government of the day and Indigenous peoples, and it would create legally enforceable rights and obligations. Now, Indigenous people and orgs already enter into contracts with different levels of government, and a treaty in a contractual form would more or less just be a comprehensive contract of a similar nature, but with the federal government directly, and might even build on existing contracts that exist. as with constitutional assimilation and state-based treaties, though, any disagreements and any misinterpretations of it or any breaches would be assessed and policed and decided by the colonial judicial system, not by us or not by an equal footing of both parties. It will be decided by the colonial court systems. And at the end of the day, they're not going to act in a way, well, they can't actually act in a way where they undermine their own sovereignty and their own power, as we saw with the Mabo decision. But does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, would you consider something like camp sovereignty where they've allowed the fire to run for 4 months with a permit, almost a type of treaty?
I suppose we could look at it in a contractual form, yeah.
Yeah, because it reminds me of the contract.
Yeah. In that regard, I suppose, it could be, somewhat seen as a treaty.
Yeah, and it gives us the right to have that fire burning and to take part of that sovereignty back, because obviously there's still a lot of things that can't be done at camp sovereignty, but that's one of the things.
Yeah. But at the same time, too, we also have to philosophically look at it. If we are seeking permits and being granted authority from another sovereign body, is it a enforcing of our own sovereignty and an act of our own sovereignty?
Yeah, it's not even really kind of like acquiescing their power to us just temporarily.
Yeah, that's probably a better way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, another like major thing that we have to really remember when we're talking about sovereignty and when we're talking about coming up against the colonial system here is that one nation cannot grant sovereignty to another nation.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
The idea of a pan Aboriginal unit across the continent. If that was to happen state by state, would that appeal to the third kind of treaty being legislation and therefore put pressure on each state or territory one at a time?
Yeah, it definitely could. It definitely could work that way. For like myself and us at the BPU, it's not the end goal that we have in mind with the Pan-Aboriginal unity stuff. Because at the end of the day, there is still these contradictions, even with state legislation treaties and stuff. Yes, we might be able to push really good for one, and we might be able to get a really solid one today, but in 10 years' time, a right-wing controlled government could just amend that legislation with the flick of a pen, and everything we fought for will just go down the drain, and we'll be back to square one, having to rally again and fight again to get those same rights back again.
I've got a question. Sorry, can you hear the background noise? Or?
A little, but shoot your question, go for it.
Yeah, just in terms of a national treaty making process that is enshrined within the Constitution. Would that you mentioned the fact that the government could amend it, appeal it, abolish it. Would that have to go to the referendum in order for that to occur?
Yeah, so a agreement that was one that was a part of or enshrined in the Australian Constitution would need a referendum to be put into there in the first place. For it to be taken out of there, it would also need a referendum. But the thing about the Constitution is, if we had a referendum and they put it in the Constitution, they would still need to create legislation to actually enforce it. And that legislation, to some degree, may or may not actually help us. The way the legislation would work around like a constitutional amendment would be, the legislation can't necessarily go against what the constitutional amendment says, but it doesn't have to fully include it or either. So, just say, for example, to make it easier to explain, just say, for example, in our treaty, we have 10 solid points, right? They could turn around and say, we're going to legislate 2 of those points and the other 8, we're not going to legislate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and even then, the way they legislate it could very much change as well, and the way that was worded as well when it went into the Constitution. So, say, for example, they talk about giving us back land rights, but they just, generically refer to it as land rights. When it actually comes to the legislative interpretation of that, they might turn around and offer us something that's weaker than native title, which is already, weak as hell and something that most mob are actually strongly opposed to, because it actually does undermine our land rights. So, you know, there is those sort of risks as well with a constitutional amendment. And the way the Constitution's set up, any sort of amendment would only be like 1 or 2 pages tops. You know, we're not going to be able to put in like a 100-page amendment into a 50-page Constitution.
Kieran, you just mentioned regarding the Constitution option. There's been movements for a Bill of Rights in the Australian Constitution, which are different from the powers. What you've referred to, the Constitution confers powers which don't necessarily need to be used. Do you think that that kind of model where there's a positive obligation, like where there's a Bill of Rights, so which then is not so dependent on legislation? That's one question. And the other one is, do you see an international treaty, given that even a constitutional change is then vulnerable to changes in the future by referendum of this racist country? Do you see an international treaty as the most unassailable kind of option?
Yeah, great questions. I'll answer the second question first. Honestly, I don't see any of these as a good option. We are going to look at why they fail in the second and why they all fail, and what a better alternative is to all of these options. But yeah, to answer the first question about a Bill of Rights, look, I suppose ultimately at the end of the day, we have to consider that the Australian government will still always put its own interests and the interests of capitalists and capitalism before any sort of, you know, rights that they would give us. And even if we had a Bill of Rights that was, you know, bulletproof and offered us all of these great things, at the end of the day, if those rights are violated and we don't have the power to enforce those rights and they are allowed to be violated, you know, what good are they, I suppose? You know, at the end of the day, you know, we have a right not to be shot and murdered by cops, but it still happens all the time to our people. You know, we have a right not to have our water supplies poisoned, but it still happens to our communities all the time. We have a right for a lot of things, and these rights are still always denied to us, despite them already existing in legislation and already existing in many other, you know, forms of law, common law and international law and whatever else. So, yeah, no, I don't really put any stock in a Bill of Rights either.
Thanks so much.
No worries.
Just the question from the chat was, do you think some of these sub-treaties are used as counter-revolutionary / liberal tactics? Treaty, in quotes, has been used this way to dampen and damage colonial action in my countries.
Cutting straight through it all and just summarizing it in one sentence, right? A treaty gives consent and gives permission and authority for our lands and our people to be occupied and governed by somebody else. That's the simple gist of it all. We know that, you know, this government isn't about helping people, whether they're blackfellas, whether they're, you know, white working class, whether they're refugees or migrants or immigrants or whoever else they are. If you're a part of the working class, you know, this government doesn't actually represent your interests, and they don't have your best interests at heart. They're going to take stuff like treaty and they're going to, you know, turn it into this reformist campaign, which doesn't actually address the primary contradictions here, which doesn't actually address our material conditions here, and instead just allows colonial Australia to give itself a pat on the back for, you know, doing the right thing, quote unquote. Treaties are counter-revolutionary and they are liberal tactics to dampen revolutionary momentum. And we're about to explain why. We're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we've got to look at what the process would look like, and some of the contradictions in this as well. I'm just being a bit mindful of time. I might just kind of not ask everyone to answer this and just kind of like skip through a little bit with the answers. So what would a treaty process look like? So, you know, we have to factor in who would be involved. Would they be selected or would they be elected by our people? Who would they be signing on behalf of? And, you know, what is better? Would it be better to look at individual treaties, or would it be better to look at some sort of pan-Aboriginal treaty with, you know, one treaty between First Nations people and the Australian occupation? So apart from the kind of treaty we could enter into with the government, one of the first issues is also what the signatory parties would actually look like. On the one side, the Australian government in the form of either the federal or state governments, will be one signatory to any form of treaty we entered into. This is already a given. But on the other side, though, we do see a range of potential signatories, as well as a range of ways they could be selected or elected. And this would also play into what we were just talking about, the potential for treaties to become counter-revolutionary dampening processes and, these reformist processes that actually hurt us. So, first, who would be involved, could be one of two things. It could be either people who are selected by either the government or by some sort of governmental First Nations body, such as some sort of reconciliation committee, or, if the Voice had been successful, it might have been, selected by the Voice, something like that. And this is something that we really have to factor in here. When we're talking about treaties, it's all well and good to assume that we'll be able to put our most staunchest Black activists forward as the ones who would actually be negotiating the treaty. But at the end of the day, that's realistically not what would happen. Realistically, what would happen is the Australian government would pick out people who belong to what we call the comprador bourgeoisie, which is the sellout class of blackfellas. They would pick out people from this class to come and negotiate the treaty with them. And, they're not going to put our interests forward on the negotiating table. They're not going to, go in there with our best interests at heart. They're going to go in there worrying about themselves, worrying about their own pay, and, trying to appeal to some colonial government, which will give them more power and more money if they do what they say. So this is something that, we really have to consider here in this process. It was different for the Māoris and it was different for the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, because when their treaties were signed, they were very much still nation states at war, at, open conflict with these people. They very much still had government structures in place that, allowed, specific chiefs and whoever else and other representatives and elders and whatnot to go and engage in these processes. But even then, despite that, we still hear all the time from our Māori cousins, and we still hear all the time from our cousins over in the First Nations people, of Turtle Island. We still hear from them all the time that quite a lot of those people that did go and sign on to those treaties, 100, 200, 300 years ago, were sellouts and were compradors. And as a result, those treaties were set up in harmful ways, and those treaties were set up in ways that didn't actually represent the wants and the needs and the interests of the First Nations people. Another thing we have to consider as well is we have to look at this government's track record and their precedents and things that they've done in the past. A prime example of this is divide and conquer tactics. When we look at stuff like past legislation, like the Native Title Act, and we look at the way that the government deliberately organised and engineered this in such a way that would cause further divisions in our communities and between our communities, we can be sure that, any sort of like individual treaty that we would enter into, like on an individual nation-based level, would do the same sort of thing. The government would, offer incentives to one nation over a nation to split us up further. They would do stuff like, give good treaties to one nation, give bad treaties to another nation, pit us against each other, as they have with native title, over, who owns particular resources, who owns particular sections of land or water, and they would really screw us over if we went into individual treaties. That is why the BPU pushes a pan-Aboriginal treaty position. At the end of the day, we don't believe in a treaty with the colonial government, but we do believe in, supporting our people and supporting our people's wishes. We do believe that if all of our people were fully informed about how a treaty operated, how a treaty would actually impact them, what it would look like, and they had all of the information to make a proper informed decision, and the majority of our people still decided that a treaty was the thing to do, a pan-Aboriginal treaty first would allow us to at least have a position on the bargaining table with the colonial government where they cannot use divide and conquer tactics against us, and where we can actually, put our best people forward to be able to push for more stronger negotiations and, push for better rights and more equality for our nations. Alrighty, so do they actually work or not? So can anybody give me examples of other treaties between First Nations and Indigenous people, First Nations / Indigenous people and colonial governments from across the world, such as treaties that were signed between the New Zealand government and the Māori people, or between the US and Canadian governments and the First Nations people of Turtle Island. Is there any other examples that people are aware of?
I don't know if it was a treaty, but between the Mexican government and the Zapatistas, that agreement and the truce.
Yeah, I guess, that could definitely be classed as a treaty of some sort. That's a great example. Can anyone think of other ones?
I'm happy to discuss some stuff from down here that are failures.
Do you want to quickly summarize the Batman Treaty?
Yeah, the Batman Treaty. Okay. So the Batman Treaty is kind of treated in a historical perspective like it was a manipulation from the settler population or the Port Phillip Association of the time, that the Aboriginal people didn't know what they were doing. But actually, the legal sense is that the Batman Treaty was a failure on the colonial law, because the colony of Victoria wasn't established yet. So the only power that they had to go through was the colony of New South Wales. And after the Port Phillip Association did the Batman Treaty with the Wurundjeri to also sell off Geelong as well, which isn't Wurundjeri land, the New South Wales government came back and rejected it and said that you can't have a treaty with one man, being John Batman, and it actually wasn't valid under their own law as well. So the Batman Treaty is null, doesn't exist.
Great little summary. Cheers. So does anyone want to have a crack at one of these other 2 points? How successful have these other treaties been at mitigating the issues caused by colonialism? What is Australia's track record like? We touched on that just before. Otherwise, we can just get straight into it.
I can add a little bit of something as well.
Yeah.
So there was a treaty like this signed in Ireland in 1921, which they lost a massive amount of their black fighters who were fighting the violent fight. And at that point, they lost a chunk of the country and they kept all the British landlords and still basically the control of the English, like totally fucked their violent revolution, which was in progress. So
also something I just want to kind of touch on real quickly as well, just on this first point, is when we talk about a treaty with the Māori people in New Zealand, as well as treaties in the US and Canada, we're not just talking about one treaty. We're talking about several hundreds, even thousands of treaties. There were several hundreds of treaties signed in each of those nations. But yeah, that's also a great point about the Irish Treaty, and how that really undermined the revolution that they were striving for at the time.
I just wanted to add, in relation to the treaty in the Maori with the Maori people in New Zealand, like the main treaty, that successive governments fought that for decades. So there was a treaty made and then it was undermined and fought and fought and fought. So I think that's an important point regarding how solid a treaty is and how much opposition it's going to get ongoing with changes in governments. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's an excellent point. If we do take an analytical approach to treaties and their impact in other nations colonized by the British Empire, we see the same startling trends of disproportional social stats that we see here in Australia. We see our Māori and First Nations cousins from North America suffering under much of the same predicaments that we do here in Australia. They have massive incarceration and deaths in custody stats, just like us. Just like us, they have poor health and a much lower life expectancy, higher child removal rates, higher rates of missing and murdered women and children, higher rates of unemployment, of illiteracy, of homelessness. And they're also, all of them are engaged in a never-ending battle to defend their country, their culture, their sacred sites, and their languages against the ongoing colonization and destruction. A treaty hasn't reconciled the inequality experienced between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in these other nations, and it hasn't alleviated their social conditions. Time and time again, we see these treaties being violated, sometimes to the extent of violent and homicidal military interventions, which actually result in the murder of First Nations people in these countries. And no, I'm not talking about 200 years ago. I'm talking about in the last couple of decades. Places like Canada, for example, in the late 90s, I think it was, or mid 90s, they had the ochre crisis over there, where a local council wanted to go and claim some land that had been given back to the First Nations people under a treaty. They wanted to go and take this land so that they could put a car park for a golf course there. The First Nations people there resisted. They, you know, went and set up all blockades and whatever else and stuff, and, you know, tried to actually hold that land. As a result, the Canadian government rolled in the military, and a young child was murdered, and several other people were shot and injured and hospitalized and whatever else. You know, this is only 20, 30 years ago, less than 30 years ago that this happened. You know, these treaty violations are still very violently happening. And, you know, when we look at stuff as well, like recently, the Dakota Access Pipeline and, you know, all those other pipelines they've been putting through the US and Canada, through lands that have, again, been given to the rightful owners under treaties, but lands that the government comes in, tries to possess so they can, you know, put capitalist infrastructure through it. And the local people resist, the First Nations people there resist. And what happens is the governments bring in military and bring in the police to violently disrupt those peaceful protests and violently dispossess those people of land that was given to them under treaties, given back to them under treaties. So, you know, when we look at that and we look at Australia's track record of doing stuff like abolishing native title, that has been handed back to people so that they can put in mines, such as what happened up in Wongan and Jagalingou country, up in North Queensland, where I think it was 2 or 3 years ago now. Adani wanted to put a mine in, that they wanted to put this mine in on land that had been given back to the local people under native title. Native title being the weakest tenure of land ownership in Australia, by the way. But, you know, this land had been given back under native title. The First Nations people there did not want the mine to go in. They opposed the mine. So Adani went to the Queensland government, who extinguished that native title and allowed Adani to go right ahead and set up a mine there. So, you know, and that's as well, not considering the fact that, as I was saying earlier, Australia already has a long proven track record of violating treaties and international agreements. They also have a proven record of suspending, amending, and superseding important legislation when it suits them. So, you know, stuff like legislated treaties, they could just suspend if they wanted to. You know, a great example of that is their suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, so that they could enact a Northern Territory response and send the military into First Nations communities in the Northern Territory, again, to snatch up land and natural resources. You know, when we look at stuff like this, like, there is no treaty that has ever been signed with First Nations people and colonizing forces that has benefited the First Nations people at the expense of the colonizing force. And in fact, you could probably even go ahead and make the claim that there has been no treaty that has been signed between First Nations people and colonizing forces that actually provides any sort of material benefit to First Nations people. None. Every single one of them has been broken as well. And that is something that is a proven fact, the breaches of every single one of those treaties with First Nations people in those 3 nations I was mentioning before, New Zealand, US, and Canada. And yeah, when we consider it this way, who still thinks a treaty is a good idea here in Australia? Every single treaty that First Nations people in places like New Zealand, the US, and Canada have signed on to have benefited the colonizing force more than they've benefited the First Nations people. Every single one of those treaties has at one point or another been broken, and every single one of those treaties has failed dismally to do anything whatsoever for those First Nations people. We don't have a treaty here. They have treaties, but despite that, they still live in the exact same social conditions that we do. You know, treaties haven't given them houses. Treaties haven't given them longer life expectancy or better opportunity at education or work. Treaties haven't, you know, protected their sacred sites from destruction. Treaties haven't given them land back properly. You know, treaties haven't done anything to actually materially benefit First Nations people in New Zealand, the US, and Canada. Why would we think that a treaty here in Australia with the Australian colony would be any different? So, what are the alternatives? You know, I don't want to just come on here and shoot down all the ideas and provide nothing as an alternative. The BPU stands on treaty. So At the BPO, as I was saying before, we believe that entering into a treaty with the government is not only a futile effort, but it is a continuation of the colonial agenda. It just further gives consent to the colony to occupy our land and to govern our people. The history of broken treaties with Indigenous people in every colonisation of the world, Australia's own track record of violating international humanitarian and human rights treaties, and the continued colonisation of this land by the government of Australia make it clear that they cannot be trusted to uphold any agreements made with Indigenous people. We reject the legitimacy of the state of Australia and its government. We reject it because it was established illegally here through the theft of our land and the genocide of our people. It is an illegal occupation, and we refuse to participate in any sort of process that gives legitimacy and recognition to the illegitimate and illegal state that is the Australian colony. As an alternative, we call for the formation of a treaty between the sovereign Indigenous nations of so-called Australia as a means to unite and rise up against the colonial regime in a true revolution of liberation. And we call for the formation of a union of First Nations that will be able to resist and fight against colonisation, against capitalism, against imperialism, and against the illegitimate state of Australia. Together, we believe that we can secure a brighter future for our people and ensure that our rights to our land and to self-determination are respected, are upheld, are enforced, and that we can actually have a true revolution and liberation here for not only First Nations people, but for all of the working class that call this continent home. So that concludes the class.